RugbyRenegade.com, the #1 online strength and conditioning program for rugby. Are you ready to get bigger, stronger, fitter, and faster and dominate your opposition? Welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast, where we build machines.
Hello and welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by Pro Athlete Supplementation. Check them out at pas-nutrition.co.uk for all your supplementation needs. And don't forget that subscribers to the Rugby Renegade program get a 40% discount on retail prices. Yes, we are back for episode 46 of the Rugby Renegade Podcast. My name's Jamie Bain, and today I interview Phil Richards. Phil's got tons of years of experience in strength and conditioning and rugby, and over the last sort of 10 years or so, he's moved more into kind of nutritional supplementation side, looking at blood testing and analysis to really individualise player or athlete's diet. Most recently he's worked with Eddie Hall, who's obviously been very successful in strongman. So we touch on his strength conditioning work, but also go more into depth on what he's doing with the blood test analysis. It's a really interesting one, so give it a listen and let us know what you think. Hi Phil, welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. Great to have you on. We normally start by the guests just telling us a little bit about their background, how they got into strength and conditioning, and what kind of teams and sports they've worked with.
Yeah, well, my background really was, I joined the army at the age of 16, an infantry regiment. I was a regimental PT instructor by the time I was 17, and that was a good little apprenticeship for me. I left the army at 21. I then ended up owning one of the largest gyms, free weights gyms in Wales and probably the UK. It was about 44,000 square foot. Did a number of years there. Sold that, did a BSc in sports nutrition, and I opened a sports nutrition shop in Llanelli. And this was not just as rugby actually went professional. It was around 96, in fact, 1996. And I had a lot of players coming to me, at that time, people like Fran Botica, Rob Appleyard, Andy Moore, and Steve Moore, and a lot of the guys who went on to play for Wales at that time. They were Stephen Jones even. I remember Stephen Jones walking in, and so it was going back that far, and I was having such great success with the guys on, sort of recommending nutritional plans and supplements, that I then was invited to apply for the job at Swansea RFC, which thankfully I got, and I spent 5 great years at Swansea. We had a great team there. I was there from 97 to 2002. We did the likes of Scott Gibbs, Garen Jenkins. We won multiple league titles and cup finals. I then took a year out then, and I went, I was going to, like Westside Barbell. I was the first European at Westside Barbell. I was first European to work with Paula Quinn and Charlie Francis and Dr. Sarah. I just went everywhere. And then I got the job at Worcester Warriors in 2003, and turned them into a very physical outfit. The first season we won 26 out of 26 when we were in the championship, come up, and, we didn't have the greatest of players, but we literally kicked the shit out of most teams, really, because of what I'd learned from so many other great coaches. And I started applying, what I'd learned from Westside, Charlie and Paula Quinn, and my own experience as well. I did a lot of experience before I got that as well. And, I had 3 great seasons at Worcester. And then I went to Harlequins for a bit. Loved it. And then I ended up consulting with Leicester Tigers and Bolton Wanderers when Sam Allardyce was there, Wigan Warriors. And then I went on work with a couple of Olympic athletes and a couple of top fighters like Amir Khan, Enzo Macronelli. And, and then it just grew from there, really. And then I've spent that was a 10-year sort of roller coaster. And then I spent the last 10 years then sort of writing books, developing nutritional products, and becoming, if there's such a word as an expert in blood chemistry analysis, and here I am.
Yeah, that's obviously some great experiences there to pull from, and I'm going to come back to some of those at Westside Barbell and Charlie Francis and things, and kind of talk about those. But this is a question we ask all the guests on the podcast, and I thought it'd be a good one to open with this time, and because I think I might know your answer, and kind of lead off onto a few different questions. So it's, what's the biggest mistake rugby players make when it comes to strength and conditioning?
I think they're, from my philosophy is simply this. First of all, you've got to get healthy. and then you can get strong, And I think too many players, why was I so successful in rugby as a strength and conditioning coach? I learned very early on that just focus on health and strength, get them strong. Don't do multiple exercises, a typical session, for example, that, I introduced all the Westside stuff. I introduced all the strongman training into rugby over 20 years ago, and I kind of discovered more as I got into it, less is more. I'll never forget sort of going to Leicester Tigers in 2006, I think it was, as a consultant there, and I looked up on the board and there was about 10 exercises there. And I said, look, the problem with this is you get through the program instead of getting anything out of it, and I just said, and fair play, Craig White was there at the time, who was a good friend of mine. Craig trusted my philosophy. And I said, look, just put power cleans in, do about 10 or 12 sets and see what happens. You've never seen so much enthusiasm and so many PBs being broken. So I think the biggest mistake the players do is that, and it's not the players' fault, it's normally inexperienced strength and conditioning coaches who unfortunately have gone through the university system and, and haven't really learned from experience yet because they haven't got it, and they think more is better, and they end up doing a multitude of exercise. And I'll never forget when I first got the Harlequins, they were doing pre-ab before we trained, and I absolutely fucking hated it, and I stopped. They were doing 30 minutes of absolute, rotate the cuff work and this and that. The problem was then the players are already fatigued before we start the fucking training session. It was just like, I'm a very simple guy, and it's very, to me, guess what? If you wanna get strong, it's quite simple. You gotta lift fucking heavy. It's not a magical formula, and to spend the whole, I said I went to Westside Barbell multiple times, and I wrote a book in it, how I combined Westside with Charlie's methodology. And then I would be able to apply that then not just to rugby, because I was working with cage fighters, I was working with elite, I was working with 100-meter Olympic sprinters, 3,000-meter steeplechasers. The philosophy is the same. It doesn't matter what the sport is. If you can get them healthy and you can get them strong, as you know, all the specificity of training comes from the training itself.
Yeah, definitely. It's great advice. And we, Rugby Renegade, we definitely propose just focusing on those fundamental lifts and getting better at those rather than trying to cover every base. There's some great advice there. Let's talk a bit more about Westside Barbell. I knew it would come out. What are the kind of big takeaways you got from spending your time? Well, tell us a bit about your time there, and then kind of what your takeaways were that you've applied to rugby and other sports.
I went there in early 2003. I'd already studied them for a year. I studied all the methodology. I'd studied like everything. I'd studied Mensa, Tudor Bomper. I was a fanatical sort of learner. And, when I got to Westside, I literally stood in a corner for a number of weeks. I took note after note after note. And the biggest thing I got from there was just the enormous amount of work that they put on the posterior chain. 90% of their workload really was, hamstrings, glutes, lower back, and that's obviously where the power is. But most people would think the power is, is the anterior part of the body, where they focus on chest and quads, and abs. But, so cut a long story short, once I started applying their methods and I took that, as I said, I had I was very fortunate where I was the head strength coach then of Worcester Warriors. And, I saw guys who should never have played professional rugby, going on and having a fucking great career just because we made them so brutally strong. Of course you need some skill set, but, that was one of the biggest things that, that I learned, and I went there many times and, they sell a book, they sell a couple of my books there now and, I had a great relationship and I'm a massive respect for Westside,
Yeah, they produce so many strong athletes, and although obviously they're powerlifters, there's so much we can learn from them that we can apply to sport. And let's just touch on Charlie Francis. I'm a massive fan of all of his work. What was it like working with him? And again, what have you taken away and applied to rugby?
Charlie was just probably the most intelligent human being I've ever met, to be honest with you. I was so lucky because he died not long after I sort of first met up with him. He actually, the day I got in to meet him, the day before, sorry, he was diagnosed with leukemia, and so he was in a bit of a stressed out condition, as you can imagine. And I spent 2 weeks with Charlie. Well, just such a, well, first of all, such a great human being, but just so intelligent. I mean, you could have a conversation with Charlie on any subject, and he was up there. He was just incredible. But his training methodology was very similar to Westside. And I think what people forget is, especially the higher you get up in any sport, whether that's rugby or cycling, or boxing, it's not the quantity of training that counts, it's the quality. And that's what Charlie was all about. Obviously when you're trying to get there, you need that foundation. But that was the biggest thing I found from him, is just that, his program planning was just exceptional. He had a great saying, and I used it ever since, don't train unless you can gain. It always stood in my mind, unless you can give 100%. And, and as I said, his program planning, I mean, he was so meticulous. I mean, it's different with a rugby player. You don't get that luxury. But, I analysed him, obviously working with sprinters, where he would do like a pre-sprint massage. And if he felt any tension, for example, in any of the hammy muscles or the calves or whatever, he'd tap the athlete on the arse and say, you need another 48 hours, because the training was such... I mean, I watched one session where, I mean, he classed it as speed endurance for his athletes. It was, they were 100-meter runners. They run 110 meters, and, they did 3 of them. And in between, they were resting between 35 and 45 minutes. Yeah. It was just, I mean, so the biggest thing I got from Charlie was recovery, quality of training, and program planning was just exceptional.
Yeah, and I think that's something in rugby we kind of don't always do well is focusing on the quality. It kind of the mental nature of some of the rugby players is, they want to feel like they're working hard, so they couldn't handle long rest periods and stuff like that. And it's definitely an education thing that we need to improve with them.
Well, you've got to, if you're not making progress, then, you need to reassess the program. That's when the quality comes in. I mean, anyone can come out of the gym, sweating and dripping and puffing and panting, but did you actually get anything? Did that workout? I'm a really big believer in, did that workout improve me? And is it going to go onto the rugby field with me? I was always big. I was never into training for the sake of it. I would always explain to the players the purpose of the session. And then, I mean, thankfully, most of them listened, and we had great results, on incredible quality of training, and it's got to be of maximum intensity. There's no such thing as a maintenance program. You're either getting better or you're getting fucking worse. Nobody stays the same, because there's always somebody getting better than you. So you've always got to keep improving.
Yeah, definitely. Great advice. And while on that, that's kind of good advice for young coaches, that obviously assessing your program as you're going through it and making sure that it's, you're getting those results, and if not, then kind of modifying. So what other advice would you give to upcoming strength and conditioning coaches? You kind of mentioned that kind of the uni system is maybe not the best thing to follow. Well,
I mean, first of all, don't get caught up in, as I call it, paralysis by analysis. I think there's just, there's so much overthinking now in professional sport that, in the strength and conditioning arena, it's just insane. Always stick to fundamentals, and, like I've also had the privilege of working with some great weightlifters as well as working with the powerlifters. And, as I mentioned to you previously, I've spent the last 2 years working with Eddie Hall. And what I love about, the reason why I'm mentioning this is not name dropping or nothing, is it's the simplicity of the programs. It's the brutality, but the simplicity. Don't get caught up in, there's so many systems out there. I mean, a typical session that I would do, with a, dependent, if it was a high-end sort of player, and depending on position as well, I was very big as I got further into rugby, that, the fast twitch fiber guys, I was much more, concentrative on, the Olympic lifting and plyometric type work and acceleration work, focusing on that, and, and obviously with a mix of slow twitch fibers, that's when Westside Barbell was just phenomenal for those guys as well. So I was really big on sort of fiber issues, but it was less and more. I mean, as I said, typical session. Say I was working, say I was called into a top team now, working with, say, a top winger. I mean, a typical session, it could be Monday morning in season. It could be set of 8 to 10 sets of power cleans, and then and then that would be the big bang, and then I would do a superset then with reverse hypers and maybe hanging leg raises to decompress the spine, 4 sets of 20 of each, and that's the session. There's nothing else I need to do. It's just like that's done. So the more, it's not about the complexity of the program. It's about the simplicity, I believe, and the intensity of the program.
Yeah, definitely. Now let's move more onto your kind of nutritional supplementation sort of approach, and obviously you said about focusing on health and how it's going to change over the years with that in mind.
Well, I first of all, I'm a clinical nutritionist. I've got a BSc in sports nutrition. I've done absolutely multiple courses in nutrition. And what everyone's missed the boat really is that nobody's I've spent the last 3 years, well, previously to that, I'd spent 10 years looking at blood under the microscope. That was something I'd spent a long time studying with, a number of doctors in that field. But it didn't really give me the real sort of clinical information I really wanted. So I've now spent the last 3 years literally locked away in my clinic, looking and doing a number of blood chemistry analysis courses. I've carried out hundreds of tests in the last 3 years from the likes of Eddie Hall, to some also elite rugby players, but right away through to stage 4 cancer patients as well. And the reason why I'm saying that is the biggest thing that I've learned from doing the blood work and the stool samples is there is not a one diet or a one supplement plan that fits all. It is so individual. It is just quite incredible. You can have a typical player, for example, I did a top player last November, very low testosterone levels, leaky gut syndrome, dysbiosis in the bowel, thyroid issues. And, and I'm sure if we'd run other tests as well, we would have seen a lot of, I'm looking at about 130 markers with this particular player, but we look at a lot more. Well, I look at a lot more now. And, as I said, you can have a player on, say, for example, a high protein diet, which is typical in the sporting world, but that player could have chronically high levels of dysbiosis in his gut. His pancreas could be so beaten up he's not even breaking down the protein. So on the blood chemistry analysis and the stool testing, we can see exactly how the digestive system is functioning, because I was a great believer in, that the reason why a lot of the athletes weren't getting the results that they should have been is because they're, from a hormonal perspective, I'd look at their testosterone levels, their DHEA levels, their insulin levels, etc., and they would always be out. But now I realize actually the reason why so many top players, top athletes are struggling so much, it's really much more before that. It's the whole gastrointestinal tract, where they got low stomach acid, so they're not breaking down the proteins. They end up having then small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which then causes chronic nutritional deficiencies. They have poor bile production, so they can't emulsify the fats. So they go on and have chronic essential fatty acid deficiencies, which we also test, and then, as I said, the pancreas is so inefficient that they don't break it down. So when we look at the stool sample as well, we can also see in there, if there's a lot of undigested fats in there and other markers, it's showing us, look, they're eating the food, but they're not digesting, absorbing and assimilating the food, and because of the stress of top end sport, it causes severe digestive systems anyway, so and one player might need to go on, if I look at the the blood work, somebody might thrive on a high carbohydrate type diet, and someone else might fucking die on it, sort of thing, in terms of performance and health. So what the blood chemistry analysis does and the stool testing, not only does it sort of individualize what nutritional requirements are, would allow that athlete player to perform at a much higher level, and also then from a supplement perspective, and this is very important because, as I said, I've done hundreds of sort of real sort of comprehensive blood tests over the last 3 years. And in most athletes, especially males, I see exceptionally high iron levels. Now, going back to the meat intake, if you're eating a shitload of meat, that's going to increase the iron levels even further. And the problem with iron is when it's very high, it causes incredible oxidative damage, which is no different to you doing a heavy squat session or heavy sort of rugby session. You get a lot of free radical damage, but it gets really nasty because bacterial infection and viruses will thrive when there's lots of iron there. And the body can't get rid of iron. The only way you can get rid of iron is to give blood, so you'll see the recommendations then, in the vast majority of people I work with, is to give blood. And I could go on and on. It's just it's the area that will change professional sport forever because, as I said, the clubs are so busy focusing in on how fast can they do 60 meters in or 40 meters, how much can they bench, squat or whatever. I'm much more interested in, okay, how is the digestive system working? Have they got chronic bacterial overgrowth? Have they got, Epstein-Barr virus? Have they got low testosterone levels, and why have they got low testosterone? Are the cortisol levels through the roof? They got fatty liver because they're eating too much carbohydrates, or they're eating too much of the wrong fats. And you'll see, what I love about this whole lab testing blood picture. It's like looking at a big canvas. You step back and you're going to see exactly where you need to fill in, the sort of blanks to make sure that this player has got this optimum health, because once a player's healthy, they've got the world that they have, the world's a bloody oyster, and all the other things fall into place. And I strongly believe that so many players, and I observed this over a long time, the reason why they were injured all the time, apart from the obvious if it's contact injuries, is because they were sick. You got a lot of sick players playing at the high end, and they're just in survival mode.
Yeah, definitely. No, really good point. We spoke off air before, saying, everyone's testing, all the physical qualities, with GPS and, velocity testing in the gym and stuff like that to individualize training, but no one's really looking at how to individualize the nutrition properly. So it's really interesting. So moving on from that, say we've got athletes listening to this who haven't had access to blood testing or not yet. What would be a good kind of starting point as a nutritional recommendation?
Well, that's the problem. I got asked that question yesterday, and it's so. There just isn't a straight answer. Yeah. If I wasn't, well schooled in, and the reason why I say that, I could say to you, okay, you could be carrying a bit of excess body fat as an example, and I'd say, I wrote a book on the ketogenic diet, for example, and I also wrote a book called The Science of Fat Loss, which took 10 years to write. It was 730 pages, and the reason why I'm saying that is like, I now realize that there's no such thing as a sort of a general sort of recommendation, because you might be so insulin resistant that me recommending a ketogenic diet to you at first sounds quite good, because a ketogenic diet was, it showed to reverse insulin resistance, which I've now found to be a lie. So those people who are on ketogenic diets, long term become chronically inflamed where they have increased insulin resistance. Or we could look then and say, you could be really lean, and I could recommend a particular diet, but you might have like 14 very severe food sensitivities to things as innocuous as fucking broccoli and tomato and celery. Never, I use the most advanced food sensitivity testing panel in the world. And that's why it's so hard now. I can't, it's the same on supplements. I just can't. If there's only two supplements I could recommend, I'd be honest with you. We've developed, some very high-end probiotics, which have gone, they're the only probiotics, in fact, in the UK, which have gone through like 14 clinical trials over the last 15 years. So I believe that most people really struggle with gut bacteria. And if you realize the absolute connection between the gut microbiome, which I've recently done a master's on, and body fat composition and performance and mood, your jaw would literally hit the floor just understanding how important that area is. and then I also then sort of high dose fish oil, which, I developed some very good products a number of years ago. If anyone's interested in that, then go on Phil Richards Performance. And I very rarely plug my products. I mean, I developed about 40 products over the last 10 years. And, so I was very sort of, deep in the research on what products work. But what I now realize, for example, I could recommend, I see a lot of male and females with, with severe thyroid issues. But you find that most of those thyroid issues, it could either be caused because of leaky gut, or they've got heavy metal toxicity, or they're constantly under stress. So, without making a molehill into a mountain, it's just very, very hard, until you test. Everything is a guessing game, you could be training twice a day and I can, usual stuff, make sure you take your recovery drink after the training session. You could have a severe fucking whey allergy, and whey, by the way, causes incredible insulin spikes as well. If you're insulin resistant and you've got a lot of inflammation, which is usually coming from the gut, you're doing all this training, but you're still gaining body fat, So that's what I love about this work that I believe will revolutionize rugby. And not only will it revolutionize, it's absolutely a pre-screener as well, because you'll see a lot of athletes like I've seen that are not far away from, from heart disease, from stroke, from autoimmune disorders, or have already got it, So, if you've got a player who's got low magnesium levels, which is 99% of people, high homocysteine, which is coming from a high meat diet, which is a very pro-inflammatory, big sort of heart attack, stroke marker. They'll have high fibrinogen levels, which thickens the blood. They'll have a high, something else called urethral sedimentation rate, which also clots the blood. You never know there's lots, that was one of the biggest excitements with me with this as well, is how it pre-screens you. You can say to the coach, look, this guy doesn't need fucking 12 sessions a week because he's carrying too much body fat. This guy needs detoxification. He needs to take these products. He might need some medication from the doc. We need to back off his training, so it's short-term pain, but you'll have long-term gain. In 6 months' time, you'll have a player who's playing like, he's never played before. It's just, I forget the name of that Leicester centre. Is it Tuilagi? Yeah, I remember working, always injured all the time. I guarantee if you run his blood work and his stool samples, you'll get to the bottom of why that player is injured so often. I did work with his brothers, by the way, many years ago, who were, they were all fantastic people, but you'd get to the bottom straight away on, unless it's contact, obviously. I'm not that dull. If it's heavy contact and the players are getting contact injuries, but you'll find the healthier that player is, the more he can tolerate, a lot more sort of trauma, and recover obviously much quicker. So there isn't a straight answer to that. Huh?
Yeah. Now, so let's talk a bit more about what you've. You said you've been working with Eddie Hall the last couple of years. What you've kind of done with him, and what kind of results he's seen as well.
Well, the work that I did with Eddie was all on the blood work, and he came to me around 2 years ago because one of his training partner, in fact, had attended one of my sort of internships. And first of all, I looked at Eddie Hall's blood under the microscope, and and we made some nutritional and supplement changes and some sort of lifestyle changes in that. And then about 6 months later, we did a full blood chemistry analysis where we looked at, just everything from how much muscle trauma, how much cardiovascular trauma, what was the liver doing, obviously what about all the hormones. I look at everything, free testosterone, total sex hormone binding globulin, DHEA, so you get this picture and you can say, look, this is what we need to do now. And then Eddie was come back then 6 months later, we'd retest, and we did that all the way up until, he won the world's strongest man. And, so we were, for example, I'm sure Eddie wouldn't mind me saying, like, he had very high iron levels, so it was a case of, the only way, as I said, you can get rid of that excess iron is phlebotomy, so, is to give blood, so, that's what, Eddie would do. And, so, there's many other changes that we made as well. But the bottom line of it was, was to get Eddie as healthy as he possibly could, for him to obviously then endure the training, and also, I watched Eddie train, and it just shows that there's plenty of ways to skin a cat, because there's nothing to do with Westside Barbell with Eddie's training, I can tell you. Yet he went on and, as he went on and deadlifted 500 kilograms. Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing that I got from working with Eddie is, is first of all the pinpoint accuracy of the lab testing, but also I have to say, I've worked with some incredible athletes. I've never met anyone like Eddie who absolutely knew that he was going to win at the highest level. His mental strength was just like nothing. As I said, I've worked with some unbelievable athletes. If you go on my website, Phil Richards Performance, and click on the testimonials, you see athletes from dozens of sports, and all at the highest level. But Eddie was definitely the guy that just impressed me the most. From his mental strength was just incredible, and that's important, because there's no point getting all your training right, your nutrition right, and everything else if you constantly keep beating the shit out of yourself with emotional sabotage. So it's having that absolute certainty that you're going to get to the top. And I'll go back to Worcester Warriors again, because as I mentioned earlier on, when I first joined there, it was a very ordinary group of guys. And, when we got promoted to the Premiership, nobody wanted to join them because, as you know, the team that comes up usually goes back down the following year. So nobody wanted to do that. So, we ended up, having a very group of ordinary guys. But it just proved to me, when you get a group of ordinary guys and you put them through some incredibly intense, intelligent training. As I said, I saw guys who should never have played Premiership rugby. I'd already knew the qualities that was required to play at that level, but they just got into such ferocious shit. Yeah, of course you've got to have a certain skill set, but I saw players, just like, who just literally blew me away on where they actually ended up going,
Yeah, definitely. That's great to be a part of something like that. So what's kind of the future for you then, Phil?
Well, I'm still I sold my company thankfully last year because I never wanted to run a business. It just grew so big. It just, it took so much of my time, and, my old passion is really sort of research. So I opened up a clinic very shortly. I still consult for Phil Richards Performance and another company that bought it called Caltech, which is a very large company on all product development, and I run nutritional seminars and stuff like that. But a clinic that I open on November the 1st in Malvern, but you don't have to come to the clinic because I do most of my consultations on Skype, will specialize in, we'll be looking at 5 lab panels really, the most comprehensive blood chemistry analysis panel in the world. And then that will be run along then 4 different panels then, which are looking at, as I said, like food sensitivity testing, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, the most advanced stool test in the world, which literally looks at some incredible markers in there, and something which we also look at then, which is the gastrointestinal wall, the permeability of the wall, because the leakier that wall is, the more chronic inflammation that you're going to get up. And people who are in intense training, and there's a couple of other triggers, it's notorious that they have what is known as leaky gut, And as I said, you'll have those players who just, it doesn't matter how hard they fucking train, they still look like a sack of shit. I saw that for years with the players that I was working with. I suffered the same, I was training, like a madman, and everything else until I, and nothing changed, until I kind of realized what I needed to do, from the lab work.
Yeah, that's cool. That's we'll if you're happy, we'll share obviously links to your website, and if anyone who's interested in getting in touch with you for maybe to learn more about this or your nutritional seminars or to actually get blood testing, we'll share all that in the show notes.
Yeah, no, great.
Well, Phil, thank you so much for your time. Great to hear about your career and advice around training and nutrition. And thanks again, and all the best for the future.
Yeah, no worries, Jamie. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Cheers.
Yeah, cheers, buddy.
So there you go. Another great podcast and some really interesting information from Phil. I'm sure we'll hear more from him about that in the future. Definitely something to look more into. But in the meantime, please subscribe to us on SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn or iTunes and give us a 5-star review. And of course, check us out for the best online subscription program for rugby players, rugbyrenegade.com. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. For more quality rugby strength and conditioning information, check us out at rugbyrenegade.com. Rugby Renegade, building machines.